So last week we read 2 Samuel 12, and we talked about how when Nathan goes to David, he doesn't speak to him about what's happened, he tells him a story. So Nathan has to tell David that he's done something wrong, but rather than say, you did something wrong, he says, let me tell you a story about two men. So we heard that story. So I like that because it's an example of how the Bible is a story. That it's not about, historical story or a scientific story. It's a story, and you're supposed to say, that story is very interesting and it's telling me something. And it's engaging your moral imagination that you're starting to think empathically about other people. So it's not about the story's facts or the people in the stories. It's about us. It's about us and it's about God. So we read that story about David. So I just thought we would continue a little bit from that to see what happens next. Naki, are the boys there, or do they feel like reading? I don't know if they're paying attention or not, or if they're doing homework.
They weren't paying attention, but I can ask. Let me try Tawa.
If anybody's heard these boys read, they do a really good job. They did a wonderful reading for us of Frederick Douglass.
We have one reader and one is in the shower. Okay. Can you see? You pinch it. Let's see.
You got to tap on it.
There you go.
Okay. Where do I read to?
From there.
All the way to pity?
You can read the whole thing.
Oh, okay. Then David's anger was greatly kindled against the man. He said to Nathan, as the Lord lives, the man who has done this deserves to die. He shall restore the lamb fourfold because he did this thing and because he had no pity. Nathan said to David, you are the man. Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel. I anointed you king over Israel, and I rescued you from the hand of Saul. I gave you your master's house. I gave you your master's house and your master's wives into your bosom, and gave you the house of Israel and Judah. If that had been too little, I would have added as much more. Now, therefore, the sword shall never depart from your house, for you have despised me, and have taken the wife of Uriah, the Hittite, to be your wife. Thus says the Lord, I will raise up trouble against you from within your own house. David said to Nathan, I have sinned against the Lord. David said to Nathan, I've sinned against the Lord. Nathan said to David, now the Lord has put away your sin. You shall not die. Nevertheless, because by this deed you have utterly scorned the Lord, the child that is born to you shall die. Then Nathan went to his house. The Lord struck the child Bathsheba's child dies. The Lord struck the child that Uriah's wife bore to David, and it became very ill. David therefore pleaded with God for the child. David fasted and went in and lay all night on the ground. The elders of his house stood beside him, urging him to rise from the ground. But he would not, nor did he eat food with them. On the seventh day, the child died.
Thank you very much.
No problem.
That's Tabo?
Yes.
Tabo, your voice has gotten deeper.
Thank you.
Very good, very good. And someday, maybe next time, I'll ask Tabo to talk about Godzilla and how I talk about Godzilla in Bible study.
Yeah.
So this is the story, continuing the story we read last time. So David did something horribly wrong. He committed adultery. As the king, taking advantage of a woman who's a subject of his, that's easily fitting within the definition of rape. there are a lot of people who see, some men having a relationship and they think, well, maybe he loves her, but you know, when it's that kind of a power dynamic, it's not. So he commits adultery, then decides to cover it up. I mean, he didn't want people to know about it, but when she gets pregnant, he wants to cover it up. He kills her husband. So the Lord tells Nathan to go to David and tell him that the Lord is displeased with what he's done. So that's what we were just talking about, right? Nathan tells a story about a rich man who steals from a poor man. And David's anger is greatly kindled because this is not about him, right? He's gonna bring down the hammer of the law. He shall restore the lamb fourfold because he did this thing and because he had no pity. So he thinks that this guy who ate his neighbor's lamb deserves, severe punishment. And Nathan, of course, lets him know that this is a story that he's been telling him, and the story is about him. So very often when we're reading the Bible, the story is about us. That's the way to take it, is that God is talking to us about our behavior. So Nathan says to David, you are the man. David hears this. So the fact that he's been imagining somebody doing something awful, and now he's had to think about how he's done something awful. There's a way in which Nathan has gotten through to him in a way that he probably wouldn't have if he directly said, you've done something wrong. These are the things you've done wrong, right? If anyone's old enough to remember Bill Clinton, when the media came at Bill Clinton and said, did you have sex with this woman? He said, I did not have sex with this woman. If Nathan went up to David and said, did you have sex with Bathsheba? He would have said, I did not have sex with Bathsheba. He would have been very defended and very ready with that answer. So Nathan telling David a story brings down his defenses, gets him thinking about moral issues, and then he's thrown into it. So I think the Bible very often gets us to think about things morally in story form, because that gets our empathy going. And we kind of think about it on a deeper, more visceral, more emotional level than intellectually thinking these are the rules that I shouldn't break, right? You're realizing that, when you break a rule, people are hurt, and you're thinking about those people that you hurt. So now I wanted to read a little bit more here, because this is God's response, through the prophet Nathan. I anointed you king. I rescued you from the hand of Saul. Saul was out to get him, would have killed him. I gave you your master's house. The Lord took Saul's house and gave it to David, and your master's wives into your bosom, and gave you the house of Israel and Judah, two huge countries brought together under his unified leadership. And this is the part that really gets me. It's like, why does God give him all this stuff, for one thing, right? If it had been too little, I would have added as much more. So David decides that he doesn't have enough women, even though he has multiple wives, right? So he has to have Bathsheba as well. So part of God's reaction to this is that you did something wrong because he did it on his own. That if David had said to God, I don't have enough, God. I'm the king of these two kingdoms. I brought them together. I have a palace. I have multiple wives, but it's not enough. If it had been too little, which I guess is maybe a crucial point, right? If it had been too little. But if in David's estimation it had been too little, God would have added as much more. That God was not finished being generous with David. So the fact that David secretly tried to accumulate more for himself, God is saying, you shouldn't have done that. You should have come to me. Which is a very curious thing, isn't it? That God would do that. I'm not quite sure what to make of it, except to say that God is generous to a fault. Why would God be this generous to this one guy? It doesn't seem fair. It doesn't seem just. But the point is that God would have been generous beyond anything that we would agree with. Now, the other thing that happens here is that God forgives David. David, says, I have sinned. He owns his sin. And God says he's going to put his sin away. But the child is going to die. So these are one of these parts in the Bible where it's phrased in a way that God is killing somebody, or God is letting somebody die. And it's phrased in a way as if it's deserved, or if it's justice somehow. So I reject that. I think all of you reject that. The fact is that the baby died. And to some people, they would say, well, that's probably because David did something wrong. So I would caution people not to read this and say, yes, God hurts or punishes people physically when they've done something wrong. But to say that if you're thinking of it as a story and you're trying to get the point of the story, the point is that when we commit sins, other people pay. An example is, smoking. You guys are all too young to remember when people were smoking, but I remember people just walking around smoking constantly. And, my mother smoked constantly. And she smoked, every time she was pregnant, she continued smoking. Now we know that when you smoke, other people get sick. We call that secondhand smoke, right? So there's a way in which these stories are letting us know that when we commit a sin, other people pay. When a married father of a family commits adultery, that has an impact on his entire family. And, when people do have adultery, they probably are just thinking about themselves, but sins like that have an impact on the family, has an impact on the community. So rather than take this literally, that God wanted the child to die or that God thought the child should die, I think we should understand that the point is for us that when we do something wrong, other people are affected by it. Sometimes they're affected more than we are in terms of very real consequences. So God has forgiven the sin, but that does not mean that there are no consequences. Our actions have consequences, and God can forgive a great deal, but is not going to necessarily relieve us of the consequences. So I think, there are many instances in the Bible where God forgives somebody for something, and we think, why would you forgive them? That's just too much, God. You should not forgive that person. You can forgive me for all the things I've done wrong, but that person, that is too horrible. And David, David is kind of treated as a hero in a lot of the Bible, but, he committed atrocities, and he does all these things here just with this one story. So David is a very complicated person in terms of the things he's done wrong and the things that maybe we would lift up as heroic, like slaying Goliath or something like that. But God's forgiveness is baffling to us sometimes. And the point is that, God forgives more than we do. And sometimes we don't even realize how in need of forgiveness we are. Or the message is that if there's something we're not forgiving ourselves for, to realize, well, if God could forgive this, we haven't done anything this horrible. And God's forgiveness is surprising and often too much in our estimation. Anyone want to add anything to that? Or ask anything?